Energy Media readers, today we're going to be talking to veteran energy journalist Shawn McCarthy, and we're going to be talking about the Value of Alberta conference that happened last week and what the strategy of the Jason Kenney government in Alberta is, whether it's likely to succeed or not. So welcome to the interview, Shawn.
Thank you, Markham. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good.
So let me frame the question or frame the discussion here, Shawn. The Value of Alberta conference was a day long. It had some recognizable names like Conrad Black, the infamous Conrad Black, talking about climate change, and separation, or Wexit, it's as often called, was a prominent theme. And as was new fiscal arrangements between the Alberta government and the Canadian government. And it was consistent with the Kenney government strategy, which is to protect the status quo, to protect business as usual in the oil and gas industry. And the essential message coming out of that, I think, in my opinion anyway, was that if we don't get what we want, we're going to, seriously look at separation or some new arrangement within Confederation. I think that's doomed to failure. What's your take on this?
Well, I think there's a lot going on, and certainly the sense of business as usual I don't think is sustainable. I understand, on the other hand, the political tactic, if you will, of saying if things don't improve, or if the federal government, doesn't do what we want, we're going to separate. I mean, this is a tactic that's tried and true. Quebec has used it for 30 years now in Canada or more, but certainly since the referendums of the 80s and 90s to elicit, special status within Canada. And it's understandable, I think, that somebody who feels that they're not represented and that their interests are not being acknowledged would use, at the very least, would use that as a cudgel to beat a federal government about the head with. Will it succeed? I don't know, but I think that certainly it has gotten attention in Ottawa, and there is a lot of concern in Ottawa about not inflaming that sense of alienation. So, it certainly is having an impact, let's say.
Well, and you can see in some of the negotiations the Kenney government has had with the Trudeau government over things like the large emitter carbon pricing in Alberta. Right. So the Notley government from 2015 to 2019 had brought in a program called the Carbon Competitiveness Incentive Regulation, and was replaced now by the TIER program of the Kenney government, which I think economists agree is a less effective, different approach, and probably less effective at reducing emissions. But the compromise was that the Kenney government agreed to a $30 a ton price, and that's probably going to be going up. So you can see already the Trudeau government didn't draw a line in the sand on carbon pricing, which was one of its key climate policies. And I think, but how much compromise is Ottawa willing to do? That, I think, is still to be determined. I don't think there's going to be much more than that kind of jockeying over, some regulations and policies. What's your take?
Well, a couple of things, and we just saw the Jack Mintz op-ed recently, and he's laying out this almost list of demands, and if we don't get it, we'll that it will, not that I'm in favor of it, of course, but it will inflame separatist opinion. That's the great dodge among a lot of the Albertans who are saying, I'm not in favor of it, but if you don't do this, then everybody, the sentiment will grow. So I think, he talked about opposition to pipelines. The federal government and the federal government needs to assert its authority on pipelines. Well, it has, and it does. So to conflate the Liberal government stand with the most aggressive and ambitious environmental stand, I think, is wrong. The Liberal government has clearly taken a middle ground there. There's going to be some key moments here, and Mintz mentioned one, and I think it will be an important moment, and that is, what does the federal government do with the Tech Frontier proposal, which, millions of, at the very least, a couple argue about how many, but 3-4 million tons of additional CO2 into the atmosphere each year. Does the federal government approve it or not? And I know that there's a lot of concern in Ottawa about which way to go with that, especially since they've said, we want zero emissions by 2050, and this is a project, if it ever gets built, will last well beyond 2050. So there are some points where I don't think you can square the circle, but I think the federal government will be far more willing to negotiate. And the other area is on the financing and equalization and stabilization funds, and there's a lot that might be given there. I mean, if the value of Alberta's resource in a low carbon economy is significantly reduced from what it would be under a business as usual scenario, then the underpinnings of the financial agreement that we've worked with for years and years is going to have to change. And we're going to have to change our attitudes about, what's possible, what's going to come from Alberta, and how it gets treated. As right now, it's still a half province, but if we're telling them that, all that resource in the ground is not worth what it was and may not be worth much at all, then it's a whole different story.
Yes, and of course that issue will be primarily determined by markets as opposed to federal policy. At least that's my take on it. But one of the things
matter.
Yes, exactly. One of the you bring up the Mintz op-ed, and especially the Professor Mintz's argument that the federal government has not asserted its authority, and that is such an egregiously wrong argument to make, because going back to the National Energy Board, and I think it's important for our readers to understand that the federal government exercises its authority over interprovincial pipelines, amongst other infrastructure, but it does it through the national regulator, which used to be the National Energy Board, now is the Canadian Energy Regulator. But it had the NEB Act of 1959. That's its primary mechanism for asserting its authority. And the NEB was structured as a superior court, and in fact has made legal rulings against the city of Burnaby, some of which were appealed all the way to Supreme Court, and they lost. Right. And so, and then of course you have the reference case that came out of BC, the BC government, and that was unsuccessful in the courts. And then you have the judicial review, which did quash the approval, but the federal government, federal lawyers argued on behalf of exclusive federal jurisdiction and appear to have won. So the idea that the federal government has somehow dropped the ball on asserting its authority is not only, it's just fundamentally inaccurate.
Right. I think that the Albertan and Rachel Notley, ahead of the last election, used this line too, that there was some sort of declaratory power that the federal government had that it was not using, that would have somehow expedited the whole matter. And it was never clear what that power would have achieved, or what's restating the fact that they had that power, and the courts have acknowledged it, what restating that they had that power would have actually achieved. So, going back to the early days when the court decision invalidated the TMX permit, there was a view that the federal government could have somehow done more, but it was never very clear how effective that more would have been, as opposed to symbolic.
Yeah, exactly right. And so I think that a lot of this argument about what the federal government, how it approaches oil and gas, is really a specious argument. It really doesn't hold water. Now, you can argue that Bill C-69, which is going to bring, has brought in a new Environmental Assessment Act, It's, you know, the industry calls, and Jason Kenney called it a, you know, a pipeline killer. But then you, on the other hand, you have people like Professor Martin Olazinski from the University of Calgary, who argues that really the new act is just a bit of a bulked up version of the Stephen Harper SIA 2012 legislation, and really is not that radical a departure. So
I think there are two key areas here where you know it's not specious at all, and that is climate policy is real, and the point of it is to constrain emissions, and that includes in the oil and gas sector, which is a large source of domestic emissions, and the Albertans, and I read it again from Joe Oliver, who's allied with the Albertan, not Albertan himself, but former natural resources minister and finance minister in the Stephen Harper government, and he's arguing that, you know, unless we have essentially a business as usual case in the oil and gas industry and allow the industry to sell gas and oil at will with some investment in new technology, then we're doing horrible disservice to Alberta. He actually denies that climate change is any kind of urgent situation. But the other one is First Nations and the concern about the United Nations Declaration and the concern in C69 that the First Nations are going to get more authority, more power to intervene here. Let's face it, the history here is that we ran roughshod over their rights, and you know they didn't have much, not only free, prior, and informed consent, but any consent to what was done in their territory. So yes, there is going to be some shift in balance here.
yeah, absolutely. And I've long argued that, in fact, what C69 does is take First Nations, they're outside the tent, and now it's trying to bring them inside the tent,
yeah,
on the principle that that'll be a more constructive kind of process, and will probably is more likely to lead to positive outcomes than negative outcomes. So
right.
Again, still to be tested with a proposal, and we'll see how that goes.
This wasn't just a Liberal thing. Jim Prentice was a big proponent of this kind of approach, remember?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I interviewed Carr. Sorry, you were talking about Prentice.
Jim Prentice, yeah.
The other Jim Carr, who was the Minister of Natural Resources, was also a big proponent of this. And I interviewed him in 2016. And he was very clear about how the Trudeau government wanted to line up its policy with the energy transition in mind and going forward. And I think that, for me, that was a big issue, because the two great trends of our time, Shawn, are climate change and the energy transition. And the approach that Alberta is taking is diametrically opposed, or it's not consistent with, it's misaligned with those two great trends. And not only that, but the oil sands producers who produce 80% of the oil in Alberta, they're lined up with those two trends. And we saw Cenovus last week announcing that it plans to be, you know, net zero emissions by 2050.
I would say they're saying they're aligning themselves with those two trends. We still need to see, you know, we still need to, that is a promise, like a lot of promises, that will be, we can assess when we see how they've met the promise, just as the Liberal promise to meet Paris targets is a promise that so far, you know, they're not on track to meet. That's debatable, but they say they are, but that's not what their own data shows. So they need new policies to get there. So, you know, I mean, yes, the industry has certainly, the oil sands industry has certainly acknowledged more than, say, CAP or Joe Oliver, God forbid, Conrad Black, that you know, climate change is a real issue, and that they need to be seen to be, and in fact be, aligned with the transition. I would agree with you. You know, getting from here to there is going to be a huge challenge for them.
Yes, I would agree with that entirely. And there's many a slip betwixt cup and lip, as they say.
Yeah.
But nevertheless, the fact that they are now publicly aligning themselves with climate change objectives, climate risk management, I think is a huge step forward, and puts them out of step with the Kenny government. But here's one of the big differences between Alberta and Quebec, in my opinion, Shawn. See what you think. But the Alberta, in order to realize its ambitions, has to build more pipelines across borders, whether you're going west to the coast or east, maybe to the east coast. And I don't think that its belligerent attitude is going to do the trick if they want to build pipelines through other provinces. I think that's hugely problematic.
I would agree with that. I mean, I think that, especially, I mean, the BC one I mean, if they want another one through Kitimat as the original one, the Northern Gateway one was planned, that's already been taken off the table by this Liberal government. So Trans Mountain is probably in train. But if you're going east, I mean, I don't think there's really much chance of persuading Quebec anyway, but certainly not by being seen as being a laggard, foot dragging their way into any kind of emissions target or doing their share to bring in a low carbon future. I mean, if they're going to win that kind of argument in Quebec, they need to be seen to be proactive. And sure, the federal government is going to have to, at a certain point, it's a federal jurisdiction, and the federal government is going to have to exercise that jurisdiction. It's not up for Quebec to say yes or no. But the realities of politics is that something that's massively opposed in Quebec, and in part because the people at the other end of the pipeline are being seen as foot draggers on an important environmental initiative. It's a pretty tough sell for a Liberal government, and a horrible. I mean, the Conservative Party of Canada, it's really betwixt a rock and a hard place in advocating for Alberta and wanting to win seats in Quebec. I mean, the other thing is trying to build pipelines through the U.S. We hear an awful lot about how we can't build pipelines in Canada. The one through British Columbia, is being built. Construction is underway. The Keystone XL and the Line 3 expansion, at least the parts that go through the U.S., are not. And that's with Trump in the White House in favor of these projects. So, I mean, it's not just a Canadian story here. And if the Democrats win the White House next November, building pipelines through the U.S. for oil sands is going to be extremely difficult.
I would agree with that wholeheartedly. And I've done a fair number of interviews with U.S. energy law professors who make the point that every pipeline that crosses a state border, where now you have federal authority involved, is protested and litigated.
Right.
Despite the claims by Canadian industry, the contrary, those aren't the facts as we know them. So, but because you've been on this beat for a long time, Shawn, I want to make an argument here and see what you think about it. I think that Alberta is doing a lousy job of energy politics. Now, I think Notley was headed in the right direction. She was, even though she got into a big fight with John Horgan in British Columbia, she was participating in the federal process. She was trying to make a constructive contribution. She was communicating with other provinces like Ontario and doing some PR work and politicking behind the scenes. I think that was at least headed in the right direction and is good politics. I think in Confederation, generally, this is about cutting deals and building allies and building coalitions of support. And the Alberta government now just wants to fight with everybody. Jason Kenney wants to do battle and then hopefully eke out some kind of compromise at the last, it seems to me. And I think that's a losing strategy. I don't think it's a winner. What do you think?
I think that there's more. I think it's more complicated than that, I would say. I think that the Kenney government is not completely offside on climate regulation. I mean, you talked about their large emitter program that the federal government has signed on for. It's actually tougher on the electricity side where there's an awful lot of coal-fired emissions and so on, and than the federal proposal. So and they do recognize that the oil sands needs to bring down at the very least its emissions per barrel. I mean, if not absolute, at least to flatline emissions from the industry as a whole. So I think that I don't think they're as completely business as usual as some of the people in the industry, and as rejectionist about climate policy as some of the people in the industry, and that the value of Alberta Conference, having Conrad Black and frankly Jack Mintz and
Joe Oliver and
Joe Oliver, as being seen as the spokespeople for your side, I don't think is helpful to them. I think they could do more. I think that they could look at energy efficiency programs, which they've gutted in the name of deficit reduction, and really make a push to show the world that they understand that this is a trend and something that's not flavor of the month, as Mr. Kenny once said, and so they could do a lot more. Again, I think that there's also wrapped up in this, though, a lot of financial negotiations around equalization and stabilization funds that the Kenny government is using this Western alienation sentiment to address that. And also, they got the tiger by the tail a little bit here. They are seen as being hand in glove with the Wexit people, even though, the premier has clearly said he's not in favor of that approach. But they don't want to see the conservative movement in Alberta split between Wexiters and Remainers, if you will, in the Conservative Party, and then have the NDP, like they did in 2015, take advantage of that split. So Kenny has to be very careful about his own base here and try and throw some red meat to those who are so hungry for red meat, at the same time as moving forward in a way that recognizes the realities of the world we live in.
Well, let's wrap this up, Shawn. I really appreciate your insights on this, but I'm gonna end with my favorite quote on that, or my favorite comment, is you catch more Canadians with honey than you do with vinegar.
There you go.
And I think that is a principle that holds true on a lot of issues, but certainly on this one. And I think that Kenny's and the industry's insistence on using vinegar at this point is going to backfire on them. Your final thoughts?
Quebec has used the vinegar approach for a long time, and I would say that it has largely worked for them. So I understand why you would look at the history of Canadian Federation and think you need some leverage to get what you want from the rest of the country through the federal government.
Shawn, thank you very much. We'll look forward to chatting with you again in the near future.
Sounds good, Markham. Take care.